I'm not going to talk about my specific project at BBC, but what I do want to talk about is, I think, quite a modest contribution to a future scenario, but also, I believe, a fairly fundamental one. And it picks up on many of the themes that other presenters have mentioned before. So I think it's an appropriate one for us to just focus on for a few minutes. My background is that I've been an educator who's worked for a long time in broadcasting, in television, for the BBC and for many other companies as well. And I've always been fascinated by the different standards and ways in which we relate to two essential tools for communication, one of which being words and the other being visual. And I've been very interested in the fact that we take the printed word and the book for granted in the way that we communicate in our everyday lives, and especially those of us, still the minority in the world as a whole, but those of us who have been taught to use the word, the text, effectively. For us, it's a currency which forms a daily intercourse and exchange with everybody, both for our own personal benefits and everybody else. I love this picture, by the way. It's a picture of books in a medieval English library. And in case you can't see it, these books are chained to the bookshelf. And of course, because in a sense, the medieval book, the Renaissance book, medieval book, was the broadcasting of its day. There was a window of opportunity. You could make an appointment, sit down, say your prayers, and turn the pages and out loud read the text. And when you finished, there was a queue behind you of someone who was going to use it as well. That was the limited opportunity that was available. And I believe that that's the limitation that we currently have with a visual word that forms such a rich part of our everyday communication, but which is literally chained in its own particular current way. So what I want to think about for a few minutes is the nature of communication and how that's going to change in this scenario over the next 15, 20 years. I haven't got any definite dates yet. We've always understood that we want to communicate our thoughts, and that communication can involve teaching, urgency, instruction, creativity, a whole number of things. But it starts with our thought. And somehow we have to decide how we're going to translate that thought into communication, a message. We need to remember that the technology that we are so familiar with now, that is the printed word and the text, originating in many ways both in this city and other places close by, has really only dominated the relationship between these two actions for the last 500 years. It's been fundamental to the way in which we conceive it. We've decided that writing about something is more important than the visualization of the idea itself. Before the text, we had to visualize it. We had to either use images or we had to use words that described images and enabled the receiver to understand what we were communicating, what we were trying to do. The text came between, and we felt, yep, this is a good device, this will work pretty well. And of course the text manifests itself in very, very many different ways. So we're familiar with email now, of course, and so the internet, as we heard earlier, hypertext is about text. Email is a critical form for us of communication on the web. We know about print in all its forms, including all the paper scattered in front of the desk in front of us here. And of course books, the printed word, the particular industry that has developed and formed around the distribution of the printed text. And it's an industry that has tended to dominate all of our conversations about copyright, about ownership, about distribution, It's the analogy that we're all wrestling with, and we're trying to transfer to this virtual world. But I do find the book industry fascinating because, in many ways, you've got lots of quite complex things going on, with everybody understanding the complexity of the world they're in. So we can walk down a high street. We can walk down a street near here, and I've got some choices. I can possibly find a second-hand bookshop and pay just a very small amount of money for a volume that I want. Or I can say, no, I'm going to go to a new bookshop and I'm going to buy a glossy version. And I understand the difference, the two different commodities I'm purchasing there. Or I can go a little bit further on and say, well, I can go to that public library and I'm going to register and I'm going to walk away with the book without having paid anything at all, because I'm borrowing it for a fixed time period. And I understand the boundaries. Or I can say, well, actually, I'm only interested in the poem on page 35 of the book that I'm concerned with. And what I'm going to do is go to the public library, borrow the book, photocopy the page, give the book back, and walk away with that photocopy. And I understand that as well. I understand the restrictions on that I can't go and sell that photocopy version, but I've got a copy for my personal consumption. I can show it to my mother, I can show it to my sister, I can show it to my friends, I can quote it, I can use it. So we have a whole edifice, a whole culture around the printed word, with very complex IP arrangements. And yet we manage it. Those of us who are literate, in the sense that we have the skills and the tools, know how to manage that environment. We know the right things to do, we know the wrong things to do, and on the back of that, the entire industry manages to survive. So I'm interested in what happens when the tools that we have to communicate begin to extend. And besides text and email and printed books and all of that formation, we then have audio becoming available on a big scale. We have music becoming something that you want to communicate with by expressing a mood or feeling or a particular message. We have still pictures. Visual pictures suddenly come back into our language of communication and what we want to say to other people. And of course, we have the moving image, which I'm particularly interested in, as being another one of the tools that we have to begin to take part in that communication. Now, once you've got a palette like that, you're moving into an entirely different communication scenario. The text is no longer the primary instrument. You have a palette that enables you to start to colour in impressionistically your feelings, your ideas, your strength of will, whatever it might be. And what's going to be interesting, I think, is how these different components of the palette will be mixed and used over the next couple of decades. Because the point is, all of these are now available through the new media that we're grappling with, or the existing media that has already arrived. And the moving image, the availability of moving image, is going to generate its own ecology, its own environment of publishers, archives, broadcasters, commercial bodies, some of whom are going to want to give you away material free to use, to quote from, to clip from, to re-edit, others of whom are going to charge you, but they're going to charge you micro rates depending on what you're going to use it for. Others will want to have a bigger commercial share. There will even be the equivalent of libraries, public libraries, of the moving image, where you will be able to use content that is for perhaps a limited amount of time. An entire ecology and industry will be built around the mass availability of moving images, just as it exists today around the mass availability of the printed text. So I think there are there's going to be a huge impact on three important concerns, which we've touched on today already and which are very important to all of us. The first one is literacy and education. because I think that we have to appreciate that the kinds of literacy, the kinds of skills that we need to engage in this new palette of communication forms is going to be very different to the text-based approach that forms the fundamental basis of the education of each of us in this room, and of many, many millions of young people today, many of whom are already moving into this much more textured way of communication. As we heard, they're using text to say, where am I, where are you? And they're using emoticons, and they're using visual images and music in order to communicate their feelings. They're already moving into this richer world, but we have an education system that's very much based on the literate form. And I believe it's going to have a huge impact on creativity, because it's going to provide a range of materials that can be used in a creative form that have hitherto been restricted to some simply available mass media. So we will have the availability of a much more complex multimedia presentation of an idea, of a communication, of a learning project, of a personal project, of a family history, of whatever it might be, or whatever purpose it will have. And of course, we know that creativity will have huge variations in quality, both high and poor and low, whatever it might be. And all of this is going to drive a massive, huge juggernaut through the current copyright understanding and shared consensus around content. It's going to force both owners and users of content and distributors of content to rethink their models. And it's going to insist that they reshape their contract with the user and how it's shared beyond that. These are the kinds of underlying issues that have affected the development of the Creative Archive project on the BBC, and indeed in some other organisations in the UK. They've all been predicated on the understanding that we are going to be moving into an era where there is a mass market in moving images. Whether or not TV still exists in that context, and I was touched that some people do believe that TV will still be around in 2020, that's great. Whether we call it TV or whatever, I don't know. It'll be a moving image culture, and one that we have to accept is here to stay. I'd like to just finish off by showing you a clip of a production made by someone using BBC archive content. And I need to set the background to this before I show it to you, because first of all, it's a very, very rough and ready production. This is by someone who's never made any moving image content before. And what she tries to do here is she is interviewing her sister, who has dyslexia, very severe dyslexia. And the point of the production is to communicate to the viewer the feelings around grappling with a personal problem like dyslexia. And she's used that approach both to inform the technique of how she's interviewed and how she's edited the program, but she's also used it in the way that she's utilized archive content. And I think it demonstrates that someone can come to the moving image with a particular issue in mind. In this case, how can I explain what it is to be dyslexic? But that when she has a palette available of images and techniques and modes of communicating, she can begin to build into something quite new. So let me just reach that for you. I don't know if we've got full sound here. If you can't hear.
There is. If you do that,
I'm going to stop it there, but that gives you a flavour of what she was trying to do with that particular approach. Thanks very much.
Any reactions or comments on the whole scenario?
Did you just give her permission to use the material, or this was her in any way to produce the video?
No, we just gave her access to the material online and under the Creative Archive license, which meant that she could use it for personal use and re-edit the material as she wished to do so.
My first reaction is this would be a very effective educational communication for health education, but most of it I would never be able to do it, and I would need some guidance if I wanted to use it for somebody I know for some disease. So it could be your role would also be to support the creation of this because it creates value.
I think it's the point I was making this morning that when you look at self-help networks, particularly on the web, particularly health-related ones, there is a huge amount of material that is of value, and it's very hard to deny access. There has to be you have to have fairly brutal rights arguments to deny access to people for use in that kind of public good way.
Well, I thought it was interesting seeing how that person used this form as you put it, to express something like having dyslexia. And I'm at the BBC as well, and a friend, or maybe a mutual friend of ours, has been working on this school report project, which people who don't know is the BBC's attempt to engage 12 and 13-year-olds, like the audience of the future, in news content, because it's so obvious they're not watching BBC News anymore. So this is a project to go into the schools and get school students to produce their own bulletins. And the project, of course, is the BBC, and I believe this time the BBC as well has been successful. But what was very interesting was that these school children have been given bits from the archive and sort of use archive and equipment to go away and make these bulletins. Obviously, very varying quality. Some which is terribly ropey, others which could be very easily broadcasted in the BBC's core outlet. But one very interesting example that I think bore out